The Krevlak's centuries-long dream of empire had become a nightmare. The Krevlak's homeworld was the type of place commonly referred to as a death world. Geologically unstable, with massive and dangerous megafauna, it lacked abundant resources except for minerals in its rocky crust. They transformed their world's sole-defining feature into a means of survival, armoring and sheltering themselves in the very minerals that contaminated their dwellings in the liquid seas. Their settlements tunneled through their planet, converting its shell into an immense nest for trillions of their species, the scale of which had never been witnessed by the galaxy before or since. United in newfound solidarity as rulers of their world, they had extended tendrils to the stars, traversing the void in fragile shuttles of carapace and bone, seeking to claim a world superior to the hellscape they had abandoned. Those they couldn't defeat they bartered with. From those who couldn't resist them, they seized. Enormous grey-gold ships of horn, the result of a consumed world, smashed and unleashed wave after wave of Krevlaks upon those who dared to oppose them. Their shocking aggression caught the established powers of the region completely by surprise. Bloody Neoris, a 16-system client state of a larger empire, was at first viewed as an ideal buffer for the Krevlak's waves. Billions perished in the clash, and the Ionese world cannons, after destroying entire fleets, went quiet one by one, as the invaders' readiness to sacrifice their holdings for the sake of combat became evident, as they disregarded every rule of war the quadrant adhered to. The Ionese monarch bowed her great crowned head in surrender, to spare her homeworld in defeat. The Krevlaks burned that world too. They expanded throughout the area, fulfilling their vision of empire, forcefully extending ever further. Living vessels searched for new planets to subjugate, new arenas to test their mettle. Planet after planet was held in bondage to this emerging threat, a race brimming with unrestrained innate aggression. As they explored the realms of the Zinthar, they discovered an anomaly. The Zinthar had concealed a secret from the rest of the galaxy, a fledgling world, home to a sentient species taking its first steps into space. The Zinthar had kept this world hidden from the other powers in the sector. It was another death world species, whose planet's harshness may have surpassed even that of the Krevlaks' homeworld. The planet featured megafauna, tectonic instability, lethal microorganisms, and intense gravitational pull. The inhabitants, however, were fragmented and contentious, engaging in conflicts with other factions over trivial matters. As expected, the Krevlaks launched an attack there too. No other species before or since has ever found such direct aggression to be as effective, yet even in this instance, they made a misstep. A rapid orbital assault signaled the Helios system to their arrival, and they promptly started deploying forces in their organic skyships, aiming to subdue major population hubs. Their fellow Deathworlders were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Some of the Krevlak survivors recount stories of impossibilities, such as soldiers impaled through the abdomen, continuing to fight with incredible strength, those severely injured sacrificing themselves just to take down more Krevlak soldiers, even the civilians attacking the Krevlaks at every opportunity. And the human governments withdrew, not following the logical and instinctual path of surrender. Instead, they defied all predator instinct to neither stand and fight nor flee in fear, instead avoiding combat whenever it wasn't on their terms. Burning biomass the Krevlaks could have utilized, resorting to such disturbingly inventive methods of brutality, like chemical warfare and anti-personnel mines, these beings refused to yield to reason even when outnumbered and outmatched. Their musculature was compact, yet their basic two-legged structure, with 5 fingers at the end of a pair of manipulating limbs, was sorely deficient in terms of fighting ability. These humans possessed no scales, no protective covering, no natural armaments, no teeth suitable for combat. So why did they struggle so fiercely? The Krevlaks had dedicated a fleet to this conflict. The humans had pledged their planet. And gradually, inexorably, the Krevlaks perished. Not typically in direct confrontation. Humans couldn't match their ferocity in battle. In fact, nearly 1 million human troops fell during the conflicts around the river, known as Volga. However, when worn down by relentless human guerrillas, a borrowed term as the Krevlax had no equivalent concept, struck by improvised explosives in urban areas and compelled to forage extensively for substantial amounts of biomass, even their robust exoskeletons couldn't endure this form of warfare, and with increasing speed, humans began to unite against them, attacking from the frigid regions where Krevlax couldn't survive long, emerging from underground shelters that seemed omnipresent, fighting room by room through a crumbling city. The Krevlax later discovered that all of these tactics had been rehearsed against their own kind. How appropriate. And in fact, the humans' frightening ingenuity and determination to survive devised something even more effective. A chemical compound, harmless to humans but fatal to Krevlax organisms, was dispersed across the atmosphere. The humans contaminated their own air to eradicate them. And for the first time in their combative history, a Krevlax fleet's instincts urged them to retreat rather than engage. These indomitable humans rose into the stars behind them. It had been ages since I had allowed myself to hope, ages since I had permitted myself to dream. We were humble farmers, artists, peaceful folk who moved at a leisurely pace. Like most of the sector, we hadn't given the Krevlax much thought when they first emerged. Just another aggressive race of space travelers, one of many recorded in history. They typically burned out or collided with unbreakable defenses until they were wiped out themselves. Ultimately, almost every such species we knew of had burned out within 16 standard cycles. Translator's note, approximately 25 Terran years. We assumed the Krevlax would be no exception, and didn't pay them much attention. That was a choice I've regretted every single year, toiling in the enormous combine fields my world has transformed into. I wince before, translator's note, physical act impossible for human anatomy, culturally similar to bowing to Krevlax soldiers on the street. The term Krevlax soldiers is somewhat redundant. The sky-cursed shelled creatures are all soldiers. Each evening I would sit outside the compound and gaze at the stars, offering prayers to our ancient deities of sky and night for salvation. I was elderly, and the Krevlax appeared indifferent. We posed no danger to them, merely serving as easily intimidated help in depleting the planet. I found myself in an ideal position to witness the shooting stars that weren't, the vessels entering the upper atmosphere. I swiftly directed my eye stalks in that direction, as this interior world rarely saw much activity. I had been quite taken aback when the ships turned out not to be the grey-gold skyships that brought terror, but instead sleek silver mechanical craft of a type I had never encountered or heard about before. I assumed at the time the Krevlax had created some sort of new weapon, as even in that bloodthirsty race there must have been thinkers, artisans of a kind, hopefully. But when the first skyship rose in greeting, the predatory vessels began to produce a fearful rattling cacophony, staccato flashes of light emanating from beneath their narrow wings. The skyship cried out, blue stains appearing across its broad side, and sank down slain. I do not know how this worked, as there was no plasma discharge spines or large missile visible. The remaining grey and gold vessels ascended desperately, only to perish under the mysterious weapon, while more of this mechanical horde touched down, unleashing their own troops. Dread coursed through me as I recalled the Krevlax invasions in a similar fashion, and my eye stalks trembled anxiously. I must admit I didn't observe what transpired immediately after, as I instinctively concealed myself from sight. I was quite certain we were witnessing an effort to replace one oppressive species with another. It wasn't as if the Krevlax had been defeated. The final image my eyes conveyed to me before they, too, were withdrawn was the closest landing soldier. I couldn't identify his species. Appearing to be composed of metal, the creature's head hissed open as it yelled incomprehensible sounds. Translator's note, it accurately replicated these noises, which sound like "Forward, you sons of bitches." There was another head within, suggesting the outer layer was a casing, but then my terror took control and I concealed myself from both Krevlax and these metal-encased newcomers. The odd rattling of the metal shell's weapons began once or twice, then ceased. I inched towards a translucent membrane in the wall, attempting to discern what was happening. My instinctive fear had diminished enough for me to do this. 2 Krevlaks cautiously crept down the street, appendages raised in threat-response posture. Then the metal-shelled invaders clanked their way out of an alley, with no chance to react. A short struggle, then only 6 metal shells, left crushed and broken beneath Krevlak's pincers, oozing rich red blood. Then 2 more of the sharp sounds, and the Krevlaks collapsed, blue blood erupting from their vitals. A metal shell perched on a faraway rooftop, clutching what appeared to be a long-barreled device, signaled with his hand, and another 4 of the intruders crept down the street. Upon hearing a sound and seeing a hand gesture, they withdrew into the spaces between translators' note specific housing units in worker compound. The remainder of the Krevlak's garrison poured out, scurrying down the street in a clicking fury, their anger directed at 2 of the metal shells who had left themselves visible. I couldn't help but wonder why they allowed themselves to be spotted by the Krevlaks, who targeted anything they saw as a threat. They made it halfway down the alley before the other metal shells on rooftops and in side streets started to fire their odd, rattling mechanical weapons. The Krevlaks shook off much of the fire, and when one fell, 3 more took its place, screaming for blood. The 2 metal shells in the path of the charge placed some sort of device on the ground before shooting into the approaching horde. I was too captivated to avert my gaze at this point, my instincts overridden by curiosity. The Krevlaks approached the 2 at the end of the alley. Their numbers reduced and, I trembled to recall it, the 2 targets were torn apart under massive pincers, and the garrison bellowed to the sky in triumph, oblivious to the death echoing around them. Then the world trembled as a column of light erupted upwards from the object the metal shells had positioned, hurling heavy Krevlaks to the sides. Their shells, toughened in the scorching tunnels of a ravaged world, shielded them from the explosion. I concealed myself once more out of terror as the earth shuddered and the walls swayed. Yet from what I observed, I don't believe the interior of the shell fared quite as well. With shells glowing red from heat, they stumbled backwards, dazed and injured, those of them able to move. The metal shells, having sheltered from their own snare, dispatched them quickly. To be thorough, they fired upon the motionless forms of every Krevlaks they encountered. They meticulously located the heads of each shredded shell, little else was recognizable, after the Krevlaks tore them to pieces, and interred them in the town's center, beside a smoldering heap of Krevlaks' remains. Our people encircled them from afar, inquisitive, expectant, and cautious, but then all they did was depart. They made no attempt to put their own leader in place. They didn't seek to communicate with us. They slaughtered the Krevlaks and continued onward. We were far too stunned to inquire about their grudge. We merely allowed ourselves to imagine freedom once more. These days, as I gaze up at the stars, I'm aware they are out there, and I feel assured that the remainder of the galaxy is cognizant of this as well. What frightened the other peoples of the galaxy most was not that a second Death World species had attained spaceflight, and indeed pushed back the empire of the first, but how swiftly these Solarians began to adapt to their environment. While their initial vessels to leave their Helios system were nearly as rudimentary as the probes they had previously launched to the stars, they learned rapidly. Gas exchanges, initially torn directly from the living hulls of Krevlak's ships in a terrifying and incongruous blend, gradually started to be substituted with mechanical systems. Steel and ceramics were phased out for high-entropy alloys. Engines, oh, the engines. Their understanding of spaceflight grew exponentially. Solarians were a species that had dreamed for ages of the stars, and they were so keen to learn once they arrived there. Somehow, this Death World species had managed to find time in a hostile environment to gain a basic grasp of advanced physics, and upon discovering the unstable natural wormhole the Krevlaks had utilized as a shortcut to Helios, succeeded in stabilizing it, something the Krevlaks couldn't comprehend at all. Before long, they pursued their attackers back through the portal, each subsequent advance bringing larger, improved, swifter ships. The galaxy observed in fascinated astonishment as the formidable Krevlax were pushed back towards their home planet. The most peculiar aspect was how the humans dealt with those worlds they found themselves controlling. The majority of the sector anticipated they would try to seize control of the border worlds and establish Terran governments, then pause to consolidate their gains. Even Krevlax fleets had taken breaks between invasions, and they showed no concern for casualties. However, these Solarians instead left traces of their presence on these worlds. A handful of wounded soldiers recovering on Paxson 7, a small settlement on that one unpronounceable planet, a beacon here and there. In essence, they made contact with every species along the vector between Helios and Racia and left a highly favorable impression. Their new acquaintances remained cautious of any species capable of emerging from a high-gravity world and defeating the Krevlax, but careful acceptance was now the prevailing attitude. The humans from Earth had left a remarkable first impression, and by maintaining limited contact, they continued to stay in everyone's good graces, with the exception of the Krevlax. With unrelenting determination, the humans pursued every single Krevlax, adapting armor to shell and showing no mercy. After all, they had received none on their ravaged homeworld. Outposts were sabotaged, forces bombarded from above, skyships hunted by intercepting vessels. In essence, they possessed all the ferocity and pride of Krevlax, but their lesser military might was balanced by strategy. Each confrontation, now that the humans were on the offensive, occurred on their own terms. The heavily fortified yet isolated planet of Mordath was isolated and abandoned, with a vast army of fanatical berserkers stranded on the surface. Space combat heavily favored the humans, as the skyships had little offensive capability, aside from boarding actions. Ground battles rarely resulted in even encounters, and on the few occasions they did, the Krevlax achieved decisive victories. But what use was triumph on the battlefield when you discover your fortified strongholds have fallen to outflanking forces, which now turn their siege weapons on your celebration? In a swift reconquest, the humans left their imprints on hundreds of worlds, and by the time they reached the teeming maze of the Krevlax system proper, their sleek, near-silent vessels appeared destined for a deadly confrontation with entrenched zealots, beings who had evolved as natural hunters of soft-skinned species like humans. They planted the agent that had purified Earth on every planet in the system, then turned back. Total and absolute destruction to every last one of the terrifying Deathworlders that had dared to attack Earth. Each spacefaring civilization prepared their own fleets in dread of what this overwhelming force might do following such devastation. And the humans came back to outposts and space stations dispersed across known space, happily talking about trade routes with trembling ambassadors. Driven by their own connections and feeling of solidarity, Solarians had ventured into the stars. They became widespread over the subsequent centuries, reaching every single system familiar to the other powers of the galaxy, and adding quite a few more to the catalogues of sentient species. Terran scientists studied at the Temples of the High within Lyrian territory. Terran vessels became synonymous with efficiency, and it was a frequent sight to see Terran merchants on the core worlds of every state. They possessed an empire without governance, a vast fleet without a leader. They did not seek to establish an empire or a purely Terran nation. If anyone attacked the humans on a racial level, they attacked them all. Nevertheless, there existed one planetary system that humans had claimed as their own. As they revisited worlds they had previously only briefly explored, they discovered the remnants of a civilization known as the Zinthar. On these planets, the final resting place of an entire species, they uncovered their own history. It required a considerable amount of time to decipher a language with no living speakers. The Zinthar had steadfastly remained in their four systems, even when faced with Krevlax fury. But they possessed both the time and the motivation to do so, especially after finding the ancient probes humanity had launched towards distant stars in their early days, preserved against time on the largest planet in the Zinthar's system. The Solarians permitted no other species to approach these planetary tombs. We have discovered a young species on the outskirts of the galaxy, inhabiting a moist, dense world they refer to as Earth. These beings are aggressive and short-lived, Yet despite their worst tendencies, they persistently strive for self-improvement. They construct, invent, and aid those they consider their own, defending them fiercely against others. If they were to view their entire planet as kin rather than just their individual factions, they could accomplish so much more. However, independence is intrinsic to their nature, and they resist external authority. They possess immense potential, if only they can unite on their own terms. We will not be notifying the galaxy about these beings. We intercept their initial forays towards the stars from encountering the broader universe, as neither is prepared for interaction with the other. Any new race that might encounter you would only perceive the conflict and discord. They would not recognize your capacity for good as we do. We will keep you protected and isolated, Solarians, and hope that someday we can traverse the stars with you as equals. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.